Hello folks, and welcome back to the Inside the Mix podcast. If you are a new listener, please do hit that subscribe button on your podcast player of choice, and don't forget to hit subscribe and the notification bell if you're watching on YouTube so you can get notified of any new episodes. If you're a returning listener, a big welcome back. So in this episode, we're going to be delving into loudness, and in particular LUFS or LKFS. So what does LUFS stand for? Loudness Units Full Scale. So this is not going to be a technical deep dive. It's sort of like a high level overview, but by the end of this episode, you'll have a better understanding of what LUFS are and perceived loudness and how you could then use this in your mixing and mastering. But before we dive into this week's episode, I just want to make you aware of a freebie we've got over at synthmusicmastering.com, and it's my 5 essential free mastering plugins. So to get this freebie, all you need to do is go to www.synthmusicmastering.com/podcast, and you can download that freebie and check out my 5 essential free mastering plugins. So let's dive into this week's episode. Okay, folks, so we are focusing on loudness and how we perceive loudness. Now, loudness is an average, okay? It's not just an instantaneous peak, so it's an average. And we perceive loudness differently across the frequency spectrum. For example, a 1 kilohertz sine wave is going to be perceived to be louder than a 50 hertz sine wave, even though they're at the same dBFS value. Now, other measurements like true peak and other metrics need to be considered, but in this episode, we're focusing on LUFS, Loudness Units Full Scale. Okay, so we're looking at LUFS, Loudness Units Full Scale, and they represent what we actually hear, because remember, we are not equally sensitive across the frequency spectrum. Okay, we're not going to perceive frequencies at the same level across the frequency spectrum, and that's where Loudness Units Full Scale come in. Well, they do in this instance for this tutorial. So here I've got an example. I've got this test tone, okay, and it's a sine wave, and I'm going to set it to 50 hertz. And there we go, 50 hertz. And it's set at minus 20 dBFS on my channel. And I've got my loudness meter here, which is just a standard one in Logic. I like to use Insight, but I'm using this one in Logic here. And I've got momentary, short-term, and integrated. Momentary is an average across 300 milliseconds. Short-term is an average across 3 seconds, and integrated is across the whole program or the whole piece or the entire performance of music, the song. And I'm going to play this now, and remember, this is at minus 20. So this is a 50 hertz sine wave at minus 20 dBFS. And I can see on the meter it's reading momentary and short-term minus 36.6, which is what I would expect. I'm now going to boost it to 1 kilohertz or 1000 hertz. And immediately you can hear it sounds louder, and it's registering as minus 32 momentary and short-term LUFS. I'm just going to turn that off because it's quite jarring, but you can hear how our ears perceive frequencies differently across the frequency spectrum. So what does this mean for your mix and master? Essentially, imagine you're in a situation whereby you've got a reference track and you're comparing your master to the reference, and you can see they're sat at approximately the same LUF. So the short term's about the same, the integrated's about the same, but yours just doesn't sound as loud. Okay, your perception is that it's not as loud, and one of the reasons could be that you've got a lot of low energy build up there. And my first point of call would be to go back to the mix, find out what it is that is taking up all that energy, and then addressing it, so that way you can then go back to the master, and then you could just boost it that little bit more, because you've given yourself a bit more headroom, okay, by tackling that low energy. So just to sort of summarize what I've said there is your mix, or your master rather, doesn't sound as loud as your reference. It's probably something to do with the low end and that low end energy. But I'm not saying that's going to be the silver bullet. There might be other things, but that's one of the places I would look. So let's give this a bit more context in terms of a mix. So I've got Insight 2 open here by iZotope, and this is my favorite metering tool. But Ulean is a free one, and that's a fantastic one as well. So do go check that one out. It's actually one of the 5 plugins in my free giveaway I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. So I've got my momentary, 300 milliseconds. I've got my integrated, the average across the piece, and I've got my short term, which is 3 seconds. And I'm going to play this and let's see where these values sit. So I can see they're bouncing around minus 20 to minus 23, which is quite quite nice. It means I haven't got any wild variations going on in there in this piece, which is exactly what I want. And then my true peak's at -10, and I've got an RMS which I think was sat around 20. Yeah, -20. So I've got a crest factor of about 10, which is great, which is what I want, because ultimately this is a sweeping statement, but a mix with a high crest factor isn't going to sound as loud as a mix with a lower crest factor. So that works perfectly for me, but I don't want to push it too far because I'm not moving into the realm of EDM. So that's just a bit of context there. So that's sat around -20 to -23 LUFS for this mix that I'm going to then take forward into mastering. So the next big question is, you've moved on from your mix, and it's this: how loud should the master be? Now, there isn't really a set answer or response for this, but you kind of want to make it sound as loud as possible, but manage the trade-offs. It's got to be conducive for the music. So as loud as it can be and as good as it can be, and whatever that may sound like. One thing you don't want to do is master to a target value. So don't just slap a metering tool on there, set it to -14 LUFS, because that's what Spotify's told you to do, and then master to that target. The advice I would give is just to master it so it sounds as good as it can be at that level. Okay, so push it. Look, do it to a reference. Pick a song in a similar genre to the one you have and look at where that one's sat, and maybe use that as a reference. Get it sounding, the perceived loudness to be the same, and then look at that integrated LUFS value. When it comes to actual streaming platforms, you'll read a lot online with regards to the level it should be sat at. For example, Spotify say -14 LUFS, -2 true peak. But personally, I think you should just master it and make it sound good. I mean, if I really had to put a figure on it, I would say an integrated level of roughly like -11 to -9 LUFS, with a max short-term level sort of no more than -10 to -9, somewhere around that. And you'll probably find that it's likely to get turned down by streaming platforms, but not that much. So if you're really unsure, that's a pretty good place to start. But once again, it's probably a sweeping statement, but that's a good place to start. But ultimately, I think, don't mix master to a target, and if it sounds good and it feels good, then roll with that. It's going to play back well on most platforms. And remember, everybody has access to a volume knob. You can turn music up and down, and in particular, turn off normalization in Spotify and then put on a playlist of your favorite music and just see what the different levels are. But remember, we have a volume knob and we can turn music up and we can turn it down. So just a quick summary. We've looked at LUFS today, loudness perception, how we perceive loudness. And remember, we don't perceive loudness the same across the frequency spectrum. We're not as sensitive across the frequency spectrum. And we did that test with the 50 hertz versus the 1 kilohertz at the same dBFS level, but the 1 kilohertz was perceived to be louder. And then we looked at metering, and we looked at short term, okay, which is 3 seconds, momentary, 300 milliseconds, and integrated LUFS values. And then we use those in terms of a mix and what we'd expect to see. We saw a mix that was between -20 to -23 LUFS integrated, and somewhere in between on the short term and momentary. And then I also gave you a bit of background, a bit of knowledge in terms of mastering and LUFS values. Now, I didn't give you a definitive answer, and it was a bit of a woolly answer, but effectively I think it's a good answer in terms of, if it sounds good, it is good, and roll with that. So folks, before you go, make sure you head over to synthmusicmastering.com/podcast and download my guide to the 5 essential free mastering plugins.